Today's guest has degrees in physics, mathematics, theology, and a PhD in philosophy. Dr. Lydia Jaeger is not only quite accomplished, but quite wise with her words and in her thoughts, specifically on the doctrine of creation, which is the topic of Dr. Jaeger's book, Ordinary Splendor. Ordinary Splendor is a translation of the original French that is out this year. And in it, Dr. Jaeger is looking at the implications that the doctrine of creation has for the way that we as humans live and work and interact with each other as creations, as God's creations. I spent a lot of this conversation playing devil's advocate in attempts to get Dr. Jaeger's thoughts on how a non-believer would approach this idea of the doctrine of creation. And she, of course, was so gracious and so wise in the way that she answered all of my questions. This is Outside Ourselves. I'm Kelsi Climbera. Enjoy today's episode. Hi, Dr. Jaeger. Thank you so much for joining me today. How's your day going?
All right, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, and we talked a little bit before we started recording. I know you're in Paris. I can hear some sirens in the background, and you said that the city is pretty empty right now because it's the middle of August. Is that right?
Yeah, August is a great time to be in Paris. Only tourists are around. So as long as you don't go to the Eiffel Tower or the Louvre, it's
Yeah,
really very quiet.
that's great. Well, I'm so excited to speak with you today. I read your book, Ordinary Splendor, which was published this year with Lexham, and I would love, as we get started, if you could kind of just tell us a little bit about yourself. I know you have a lot of degrees in varying subjects, which I think is amazing. So if you could kind of just tell us what you've studied over the years and your background, I think that would be a great place to start.
Yeah, my original studies were in physics, and then I went on to do theology. And when I started to think about a topic for the master thesis, I was thinking of joining physics and theology. And so I worked on the concept of laws of nature. And doing this, I realized that I needed a third dialogue partner, philosophy of science. So I went on and did a PhD in philosophy of science. But I now teach theology, so that's my main area.
Okay. And what would you say, what was kind of your, growing up, your interest? Was it more physics? Was it more theology? How did you kind of get started and decide that those were things that you needed to marry and look into more?
I don't really see an opposition between physics and theology. So I
Yeah.
was broadly interested in school, both in, say, humanities and natural sciences and mathematics. And when I had to decide to go for university studies, I decided to go for physics because I was fascinated by the order in nature. So the very idea that you can, say, take a pen and then drop it and you know that it will fall and that you can even calculate how it falls. So it's this very idea of natural order and being describable in mathematical equations, I found that very fascinating. But then if you come from a Christian background,
Mm-hmm.
it's in a certain sense not surprising because you know that the world is created by a wise and faithful creator. And therefore, you should expect there to be order. And so this is how I got started in physics. And then, yeah, going to theology, it was going from the book of the works of God to the book of the words of God. And so both books are, authored by the
Yeah.
same God, by the same author. And therefore, you can link both.
Yeah, they're complementary. I'm curious, I know that in Europe you all are ahead of us as far as post-Christian culture, and you know, probably fewer and fewer Christians. That's something that we talk a lot about in America as currently happening. What is that like being in academia in Europe? Have you gotten a lot of pushback for kind of studying these two things at once, or three things at once? Is there opposition to that? Or do you feel like there's quite a few people who are doing the same type of study as you?
It really depends on where you study. So
Mm.
my own studies are in three different European countries and three very different contexts. So I did my physics in Germany, because I'm German. I did theology in France because I went into theology out of, it was a response to a call to mission work, and therefore I wanted to do theology in a foreign country. So I did theology and then philosophy of science in France. But for my PhD, although it was at the Sorbonne University, or one of the Sorbonne universities, I went for extended periods of studies to Cambridge University.
Mm.
And
Okay.
so in England, Cambridge, England. And so three very, very different areas. So when it comes to experience about how to link theology and science, in fact, my interest in physics really came out of interaction with a high school teacher who had been a researcher in physics, in atomic physics, nuclear physics. And he was a very, very good teacher, and he really got me interested in this area. But at the same time, he was an atheist, so that was
Hmm.
very and he was really torn apart because he really liked the idea that I would go and study physics, but he didn't like at all that I was a Christian. So
Huh.
that was rather interesting from the
Yeah.
very start. Then during my time in physics, I really met with different reactions. My own supervisor was very much interested in the interaction between science and theology. Another professor at Cologne University as well. Obviously, in theology, then in France, I did it at a free seminary. You can't study theology in a state university in France because
Hmm.
of the strict separation between state and church. Strasbourg is a historical exception, so it's kind of
Yeah.
funny thing. You can do theology in Strasbourg, but
Yeah.
this is an exception to the general rule for historical reasons. And
Yes.
then when I applied for the PhD, or not for the PhD, but it's a master degree in order to be able to do a PhD, then I really met with this opposition to a subject linking theology and science. And at first, in fact, my proposal was turned down. And then one of the lecturers stepped in and said, "Oh, I'll accept her." And in fact, he turned out to be a Buddhist. So that
Oh wow.
was coming from a different angle. So it was not easy because we had very different, I would say, conflicting religious perspectives. But at least he was open to
Mm.
look into these questions because of his Buddhist
Yeah.
involvement.
Very interesting. I'm always curious, kind of the paths that people take and what that experience is like. So I appreciate you sharing a little bit about that. So to Ordinary Splendor, you've written this book. It's very accessible. It's very practical, and it's on the doctrine of creation. And I'm curious, given your background, why you decided to why you're interested in the doctrine of creation in general, how you kind of became interested in that subject, and why you decided to write a book that focuses so much on that over and against scientific arguments for creation. You talk a little bit about that, I think, in your introduction, but I'm curious why you decided that's the route you needed to take, and this is the book that you needed to write.
So the doctrine of creation obviously is crucial if you want to link science and theology. So
Mm.
if you want to understand what science is doing from a biblical point of view, you need to come to terms with the doctrine of creation. And so it was kind of natural as a scientist to turn towards creation. So while leaving aside the very scientific questions, different reasons for this, I went on to do some work on this later on. So I've written on it in other places after, in fact, the ordinary Splendor, because this is the American translation of a book which came out earlier in French. So yeah, obviously I've been interested in more scientific issues as well, but I really believe, and the longer I work on the doctrine of creation, I think it's important not to reduce the doctrine of creation to debates about scientific theories of origins.
Mm.
There is so much more to creation than the debate about the modalities of creation. So creation is really a very, very fundamental, it's the very foundation, in fact, of the biblical worldview. It's not by happenstance that the Bible opens with it. And you can't understand the Bible, you can't understand our world, you can't understand our life if you don't understand creation.
Mm.
And so there's so much more to creation than the debate about sciences. And I think very often creation gets sometimes taken as a hostage. So both from
Yeah.
atheists
Yeah.
and Christians. So
Hmm.
those who believe in evolution think that therefore creation can't be true, and perhaps Christian either they don't want to talk perhaps even about creation, but because they think it's a kind of a hot issue and it will get them into conflict. And many don't realize what you can get out of the doctrine of creation for your life, for your very
Mm.
ordinary life.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think you say too at some point that science is the study of what is. It's not the study of what um of of creation, of creating out of nothing. And here we have this beautiful doctrine that gives us that. Um and so putting it all on science to explain everything isn't necessarily fair because there's a limit to science. Are there what Can you talk a little bit about these um, the limits that come with science and what it can give us? Because I think that this is a common misunderstanding for people. They so often, especially non-believers, non-Christians, look to science to give them all of the answers without realizing that the study in and of itself is limited. It can't provide all of that. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like?
Obviously, there is one principal limit to science is that science works with or starts from what exists.
Yeah.
And so science can't explain why there is something rather than nothing. So the
Yeah.
very basic question, why is there something, science can't answer it. And so sometimes you get scientific theories about the origin, but you should never forget that they start from something. At least they start from a set of natural laws.
Yeah.
So if you don't have any natural laws, then you can't get, in fact, any scientific theory which would explain anything. So the very question of why there is something, which is the starting point of what is called the cosmological argument for the existence of God. This very question, science can't by definition can't give an answer, and it's no critique of science. Science isn't meant to answer these questions.
Right.
Then I would claim that science can't explain us what human beings are, at least can't explain it in all their dimensions, all the facets of their being.
Mm.
There are many very interesting questions about humans which science can answer, or which the different branches of science can answer, but not all of them. Especially humans are relational beings. There is something in the second person encounter which is not captured in science. So the I-you relationship, we are persons.
Mm. Hmm.
with creativity, and yeah, then science can't reach up to God. So science isn't meant to do this. Once again, this is not a critique of science. It's just science is not meant to describe God by definition.
Yeah.
It's meant to describe nature, and therefore the relation between human beings and God is not part of scientific description.
Hmm.
Moral is another very interesting, I think,
Yeah.
area. So just now in the cinemas here in France, we have this new film on Oppenheimer. Yeah,
Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm.
and uh, and so there you have in the at the very heart of scientific research, there are moral questions, but
Yeah.
science can't answer them.
Hmm.
These are difficult questions, even for a
Mm-hmm.
theologian. They're not easy to answer, but science by itself can't answer the moral questions which arise in its practice. So,
Hmm.
because science is about what is, it's not about what should be. So, it doesn't give
Hmm.
us rules how to behave. Science is important to inform our ethics. So, if we
Yes.
talk about, say, climate change, a very burning issue these days, science is very important because we need to know what are um, the, the mechanisms behind
Mm-hmm.
climate change in order to react against it, or at least say slow it down or whatever. But so we
Mm-hmm.
need science for it. But it's not science which will tell us that we should, for example, preserve an environment where human beings and other living beings can survive. This is
Mm.
not it's not science which gives us this norm.
Mm. That's a such a helpful distinction, and one that when I think when science becomes your god, it's so easy to look to it for those answers, for those moral answers, because you have nowhere else to look. And so I think that that distinction, that it can't tell you what came out of nothing, and it can't tell you the future, what should be, but it lives really in the present, what is, and observations of that is very helpful for people. Um,
Yeah,
and I think
obviously.
you go ahead. Yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead.
obviously, science is important also for natural history. So I'm not saying that
Yes,
any historical
right.
questions is out of scope. So there's
Yes,
natural history which can be studied by science.
yes,
And I think Christians should be careful not to talk nonsense about, say, natural history. But
right.
it's important to see what the limits of the scientific endeavor are, and I would even say that recognizing the limits of science when you're a Christian is safeguarding science, because we see in our societies both attitudes towards science. We see this overconfidence in science, but science, yeah, you're right, is an idol. And some people expect everything from science. So
Mm,
science just has to solve all problems of humanity. But you also see the other attitude that people would not listen to scientists.
right.
We had it during the COVID crisis, where
Hmm.
there was some, at least in some quarters, mistrust in whatever scientists would say,
Yeah.
and it was very dangerous, and people died because of this mistrust of
Hmm.
science. And I think it's inevitable if you put too much emphasis on science, if you don't respect its limits, then science will not give you what you want science to give you, and
Hmm.
therefore you will turn away from it. So you need to see the right place of science in order to respect it in its limits, in its domain.
I'm curious if you think there's any apologetic benefit for the non-believer in looking towards the Christian doctrine of creation. Is that something worth presenting to a non-believer? Or is there another starting point that you usually begin with?
Obviously, it depends all on the non-believer, or so on
Yeah,
the non-Christian you
right.
talk to, because uh, So I just did a podcast on Abraham Kuyper the other day, and Abraham Kuyper, the founder of Neo Calvinism, would underline that all believe. The question is just what you believe. So everybody
Mm.
has faith.
Right.
But yeah, so if we talk about the non-Christian, yes, it really depends on the non-Christian. But I would say creation is a very relevant starting point, because you can't make sense of the world without the doctrine of creation. So we just
Mm.
talked about science, the very presuppositions of science, that the world is ordered, that human beings can understand the world. For example, just to take two very important presuppositions of the scientific method, they don't make sense without the doctrine of creation. So you can show this to a person who is scientifically minded.
Mm.
Or somebody worried about human freedom. You could show them that only because humans are created in the image of God, they have true freedom. So obviously, I'm just pointing to the arguments. You need to make these arguments, but you
Hmm.
can make them. That if you want to have human freedom, true human freedom, you need a creation by a free, transcendent creator God.
Hmm.
So, and we could go on. So if you want to have, say, family, happy, say, or a good understanding even of human sexuality, you could, the argument may be even more difficult to make these days, but in
Yeah.
principle I think it can be made that it only makes sense in a world which is created.
Mm.
Or take, it's one of the points I raises in the book, that humans are finite beings and that this finitude is good. This is
Right.
typically coming out of the doctrine of creation. So I think showing a non-Christian how fruitful it is to understand this world as created can be an entrance point for an entry point for thinking about the biblical worldview.
Yeah. That's great. Um, one one thing that I've heard quite frequently lately in the past few years is that the biblical creation story, the biblical creation narrative, is either similar to other ancient creation stories, or it's actually rooted in those stories. That those other stories came first, and you actually disagree with this, because I know this because you compare the creation story of the Bible directly to some of these ancient myths, and you have excerpts in your book, which I loved getting to see those. I haven't actually, I've heard about these stories, but I haven't looked into it enough to actually read them myself. Can you talk about how the biblical creation story stands out against these other narratives, and why you think it's not rooted in one of them?
Obviously, it's rooted in them in the sense that it's part of the same cultural setting.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
so it's relevant to compare
Yes.
the creation stories in the Bible to the ancient Near Eastern world, and there are
Mm.
points of context. Partly
Right.
because we live in the same world, and partly because they're really direct context. So there are, especially if you compare it with texts from Ugarit. So there is in some texts you would say the biblical author is echoing or interacting, yeah, with patterns, ideas he finds in his context.
Right.
But I would say it's really sufficient to just start and read some of these texts in order to
Mm.
see that once you enter into the Genesis accounts, you enter into a different world.
Yeah.
Literally, it's a different world. So typically, the ancient Near Eastern stories about origins would be stories about gods as well. So it's both the origin of the world, but before the origin of the world is the origins of gods. And there are different gods, and they're in conflict, and they're combating each other. And so humanity very often is created inside this struggle between gods. You don't get this transcendent God just speaking. So
Mm.
the sovereign, transcendent God who just speaks and everything happens according to his word. So that there is no resistance, there is nothing or nobody who could say, yeah, be an obstacle to God's work. So it's a completely different way.
Yeah.
It's much more peaceful, in fact, when you enter,
Yeah.
especially Genesis 1, Genesis 2. It's a very different setting. So there's one God, not many. It's one God with no, is eternal. So and he just acts by his word.
Mm.
And this gives you a completely different outlook on the world. So it's the foundation for natural order. Also for humanity. Humanity is not created out of a struggle. It's not created. So you have some creation accounts where humans are created because the lesser gods no longer want to work for the
Yes.
more upper class gods.
Yeah.
And so they create humans kind of slaves to replace them. So this kind of utilitarian approach to humans is completely absent from the Genesis accounts.
Yes, yeah. We see God as caretaker and even as good. Would you say that that's correct in comparison to the way
Yes,
that
yeah,
gods are
absolutely.
portrayed
Yeah,
otherwise?
because God is good and his creation is good. This is the very
Right.
message of Genesis 1. And we need to
Yeah.
hear this because we live in a fallen world. And therefore, we need to listen to what the world was at the beginning and what God's project is for the world.
Yeah.
And the very idea, in fact, of a transcendent God is, yeah, the absolute opposite of paganism.
Yeah.
You get in paganism, you get continuity between the world and the gods.
Mm,
And only in the Bible you have this transcendent God who is
mm,
really at the origin of everything, but he is not part of the world.
yeah. I'm glad that you brought up the context in which this is written too, because that's so often I think that these critiques of the Bible and Scripture uh, overlook that, and they overlook the fact that the writers of Scripture are writing in a time and in a place to an audience, and so they're either writing in a style that they know their audience will understand, or they're addressing issues, and that's really important and actually good news for us. It's not it would be way worse if the Bible was like written in some vacuum without any context. I think that would be harder to convince people that it's true and it has meaning and significance. Another kind of thing that I hear people bring up, an argument against the creation story, is that there's two creation stories. We see Genesis 1 and then Genesis 2, and that they conflict in some way. Can you talk a little bit about why there are two, if there's a reason or thought behind that, and then how you see those two stories and two narratives interacting with each other?
Yeah, so obviously there are two creation accounts. They're very different from each other. So it's part of, so I'm not a specialist in source criticism of the Pentateuch, but so
Yeah.
this is part of the idea that you have different sources, different documents. I would just want to draw the attention to a point which is sometimes overlooked, that the very idea, the documentary hypothesis, originated in the 19th century in Germany. So
Mm.
far before we really knew a lot about ancient Near Eastern literature and writing habits, etc. So we should be very cautious in just clinging to these ideas, and
Mm.
it's a speculation. Yeah, we
Mm.
don't have any proofs of these different sources. If you just take the texts as they stand, yeah, they are different for sure. Different style, I would say, even different literary genre. They have a different topic, and I think this is why, or a slightly different topic.
Mm.
This is why I think there are differences, and these differences are only contradictions if you read them in a kind of very literalistic way. So Genesis 1 is really a very broad, say, picture of creation. Really, it sets the great scene. It's kind of the opening, yeah, like an opening of an opera. So the
Yeah.
overture. Yeah.
Okay.
For the whole Bible, I would say. And
Mm.
then Genesis 2 is, in fact, Genesis 2 goes with Genesis 3. There's obviously the
Right.
same story continued.
Yeah.
So this is about the creation of humanity and the rebellion against God.
Mm.
So then, obviously, the question is, what is the literature genre of this story? And then your interpretation depends on this. But you have to recognize that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 and 3 are different, I think, literary genres. And especially Genesis 1 is a highly well crafted piece of art.
Hmm.
It's not really poetry because it's not the Hebrew poetry. They in Hebrew you get these parallel verses, so which we know from Proverbs or the Psalms. So that is not the case of Genesis 1, but it's a highly crafted text. You can make word accounts, and it all fits very nicely.
Mm-hmm.
And so so you have to read this in a certain way, and then Genesis 2 and 3 are kind of sometimes I compare it to these naive paintings. I don't know, is it the same word in American? So this naive style of paintings where you first get the impression that the painter don't know how to do a better job and does a very naive in fact drawing, but
Yeah.
it's part
Okay.
of the style. And so Genesis 2 and 3, I would say, is something like this. It's a kind of naive painting,
Okay.
but in fact, it's not because the author doesn't know how to do better, because this is just part of the message, and it really brings over very powerfully, very important theological insights.
Yes. Yeah. That's helpful to, I'm thinking of it now and you can correct me, but almost like Genesis 1 is the opening. It's getting your attention. It's a big, uh, the big picture, and then we're kind of getting into the more of the narrative and the details in 2 and 3, but there's obviously some repetition there because it's telling some of the same things over. Is that a good way to think of it?
Yeah, and there is even a very important textual clue to it, because there is a transition phrase between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. In fact, the first creation account goes to Genesis 2, verse 3. And then the second creation account starts at verse 4. So when you say Genesis 1, Genesis 2, in fact, we
Yeah.
are talking about Genesis 1 up and the first 3 verses of Genesis 2. And in Genesis 2, verse 3, so you have, I just need to check. No, it's
Yeah. Yeah.
so you have verses 4, which is I think, the opening phrase of the second account. You have the order, the heaven and the earth.
Hmm.
And then in the second half of the verse, it's reversed. It's the earth and the heaven. So it's the time when God made
Mm.
the earth and the heaven. And this changed order shows that now we're focusing, in fact, on the earth, and we
Yes.
focus on humanity. And
Oh,
so you
wow.
get much more detail on the creation of humanity, much more
Yeah.
detail on the difference between man and woman. So you
Mm.
had this already in Genesis 1, man and woman, but now we're getting much more detail on this. And so it's intentional that you get a second
Hmm.
account, and with a different focus.
Yeah. That's really cool. I had not picked up on that. That's a very, very helpful transition. You say this as I think this is in one of the beginning chapters where you're talking about understanding our existence is rooted in God. You say if we do not find our origins in the creator, we do not have any right to exist. Our life is devoid of meaning and direction. It grows in a haphazard way and in all directions, which I agree with, and I think that's a beautiful way to put it. But again, I think I feel like this is kind of some of the theme of our conversation. Um, I can hear the rebuttal to that in my head from a non-believer, a non-Christian who says, that's not true. I have tons of meaning in my life. I, whether it's if you dug into that a little bit more, they might have a little bit more trouble explaining that. But I could see someone saying that they create the meaning, or they create the significance in their life, and or in the way that they choose to live. What would you say to that argument as kind of a response to this idea that we really only have meaning because of a creator?
Depending on the person, I would react in two complementary ways.
Hmm.
So first, you could push back and say, no, in fact, you imagine that you have meaning in your life, but you don't.
Hmm.
Because if the meaning is just self-created, then it's arbitrary.
Hmm.
And meaning is something, it must come from a purpose which is given to you. If you just decide that this is your purpose, but that it's not a call, it's not a vocation, then it doesn't have any force. It's not a norm. So you can't give yourself a
Hmm.
norm by which to live.
Yeah.
Or else it becomes completely arbitrary, and so you can decide this and another person can decide that. And who would then say, so if, for example, your neighbor decided that the purpose of his life is to make your life difficult, then who are you to tell him that this is not the right purpose of his life?
Hmm.
And I think you can really see it in existentialism. So
Yeah.
I found it very interesting when my attention was drawn to Sartre and his novel Nausea, where he
Yes.
really is. I think it's a very honest. So you're in a setting where humans just decide for themselves what the purpose of their life is. So they are their own creators in that sense.
Yeah.
And he's very honest that in the end it just leads to nausea. It doesn't give you this transcendent meaning you need. So that would be one way of argument, just to push back and to say, if you really look at things, you can't have purpose if it doesn't come from a transcendent source.
Hmm.
The other way would be to say, oh yes, many human beings, in fact, they live meaningful lives, even without believing in God. But this is borrowed capital. So I use an expression from Cornelius van Til, another neo-Calvinist here, and he refers to the prodigal son. So the prodigal son lives, in fact, abroad for quite a while
Hmm.
with the riches he brought with him from his father's house.
Mm-hmm.
And Cornelius van Til says, in fact, unbelievers, non-Christians, in fact, this is what they do. They, whatever there is in terms of truth, in terms of meaning in their lives, it's borrowed capital. It's taken
Hmm.
from God's creation. And therefore, another way to say that, okay, so let me see what the meaning of your life is, and then I'll tell you that the only foundation for this meaning is, in fact, reference to the Creator
Hmm.
God. So, in a certain sense, you behave better than you know. So it's you're at least there is some aspect of biblical truth in your life. For example, you believe that it's important to perhaps to help the poor. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's part of the biblical worldview, and I now tell you why you need creation. You need humans created in the image of God to really understand the dignity of human beings
Yeah.
independently of their social status. So once
Hmm.
again, you need to make these arguments in a much more refined way. I'm just so waving my hands, I just point to the argument. So you need to make them, but this is the direction I would go.
Yeah, that's helpful. I think this idea that we all love, especially I think my generation loves the idea that we are, well, my generation and younger, that we are creators. And I think you point out early on that that word creator is not actually used to describe humans in Genesis, or in at least the creation account. It's only used to describe what God is doing. We are instead called makers. Is that a distinction that you that you make? Am I remembering that correctly? I
The
might be.
Hebrew word bara, to create, is only used, yeah, for God.
Yeah.
Then the creative action of God is described not only by this word, but also by other words, to make, for
Okay.
example, to shape. And these words are used for human beings. So once
Okay.
again, I would say, yes, we are creators, but we are small creators. So we are
Yes.
under creators,
Yes.
under the authority of God. And it's only, so we are always working with the material and with the form which God has created in the first place. And
Right.
then we can give shape to it, we can develop it. And even in procreation, yeah, we can even give
Right.
rise to new human persons. So
Right.
that's absolutely extraordinary, that the sexual union between a man and a woman can bring about another human person. So
Mm.
there is something of a great dignity humans
Mm.
have, but it's because God is the creator and we are just working under him and starting from his creation.
Yeah. And that is such a, it's a foreign concept, I think, for so many people, but it's so freeing. I'm actually 7 months pregnant. And so I've been doing these um, little workouts for pregnancy. And it's so funny. The instructor will say things like, "You're creating a whole human. You're amazing. You're doing that all on your own." And I just have to laugh a little bit because uh, just the weight of thinking that that's all on me is actually very it's a very heavy burden. I would say I would take it that way. It's not as freeing and as enlightening as I think, or empowering as they think it is. But when you can, like you're saying, see that God has given you this gift and that you're able to whether we're talking about pregnancy for a woman or some or a vocation or whatever, you're able to do that. What a gift. And I think that that changes how you view work and how you view your vocation in a really beautiful and freeing way.
Yeah, and it also gives a place for the father.
Yes, yeah,
You're doing it on
which
your
is
own.
important. Yes, also very, very true. You're not creating a human all on your own. I'm curious, how do you see the doctrine of creation as related to the doctrine of salvation? How do we get from point A to point B for ourselves and for others? Because obviously this is also the I would say the key to Christianity, to having faith as a Christian, is the doctrine of salvation. So how do we connect those two?
Yeah, creation is this not the starting point of salvation, but you can't understand salvation without creation.
Mm,
So sometimes we summarize the biblical worldview in these three words: so creation, sin, redemption.
mm,
And so you have creation. This is God's original work, his plan for the world, for humans. And then sin came in and, yeah, corrupted creation. And salvation is the restoration of creation. So you can't understand salvation if you don't know creation, because
yeah.
then you don't know where you go. And salvation is not the it's not the abolishing of creation. It's really reinforcing, reinstating creation.
Mm,
There is an aspect of, I would say, going beyond the first creation. Yes, when God works, his work is so excellent that he's not just restoring, repairing what has gone wrong, but he does it even better, or even he accomplishes it. So when you read, especially Revelation, the last two chapters, you get a feeling that the second creation is it's more glorious than the first
yeah.
creation
Right.
has been. But in the very first instance, yeah, in the first, if you want to say first approximation using a scientific language, salvation is the restoration of creation, and it's certainly
Yeah.
not abolishing creation. And this is even important when you understand, in order to understand what we are meant to be as Christians.
Mm.
I think many Christians and non-Christians think that being a Christian is becoming something or somebody a little bit awkward, out of the world, disconnected from reality. I remember when I worked for the Salvation Army, they had sanctification seminaries, so holiness
Mm.
courses. And when I told people that I was going for a holiness week, so they were imagining very, very strange things what we would be doing. But then if you think what true holiness is, it means that we become the human beings we were meant to be,
Mm.
including all the aspects of human beings. So eating, celebrating, being in
Right.
relationship with others. So it's not the monk in his cell praying all day. So it's
Yeah.
uh, being a saint, is being
Yes.
a true human beings.
Yeah.
And fortunately sometimes Christian can really model it. So I can think of some saints who are very these worldly saints at the same time that they're really tuned into the coming world.
Yeah. I thought that's great. And I think that your argument to think of the Imago Dei as relational is very helpful in how we kind of connect these pieces as well. In my tradition, I don't know if you know Dr. Robert Kolb. He's a Luther scholar, but he's done a lot of work on um, talking about and defining justification in terms of restored relationship with God as creator. And so, thinking obviously of the fact that we were created in the image of God to be in relationship to Him, to have relationship with Him, and to have, and then more fully, broadly, have relationship with His other creation, whether that's our neighbor or the creation of the world around us. I think is really helpful for people, and that idea that we're not we're not supposed to be monks locked away in cells. We're not escaping our bodies to some higher enlightenment is I would say very beautiful, and I think very unique to Christianity.
Yeah, and it doesn't contradict at all, but it goes together with say more judicial understandings of justification,
Mm,
justification by faith or penal substitution. All these
right.
subjects, they're linked because um, it's about the relationship to our Creator, who
Yeah.
is the sovereign judge. And so sin and our sin has to be dealt with, and our judicial debt has to be dealt with in order to restore this relation. So all these themes or these different ways to see the relationship to God, in fact, are complementary. And then
Mm.
perhaps just one word on monks. We
Yeah.
were just talking about encourager. I think there can be
Yes.
a call to a life of prayer, a specific call for some people. But even then, I would say it's a call in community, and
Yeah.
it's not escaping from the world. But yeah, just in order to do justice.
Yes. Don't make
To,
a straw man of the monks. That's good. That's helpful. Um, you spend much of the book kind of drawing out these implications of what the doctrine of creation gives us. And we've mentioned some of them: human dignity, entering into God's blessing, being man and woman. But so often these are viewed as um, less of a gift than an actual limit, and that's actually one of the things you talk about too, is human limits and how that's a gift. Would you say there's one of those in particular that you think is really essential for today's world, that you see people struggling with, one or two that you just keep coming back to, that you think people need a better understanding of? Or do you think kind of just a broad understanding is helpful for people?
so in terms of limits, human finitude. I think it's
Yeah.
it's obviously it's important today as it probably has been in other
Right.
areas, but it's probably even more important today because we have a lot more of technical possibilities, and they're a
Yeah.
blessing, I would say. In the first place, once again, it's bringing out creational possibilities. So even doing this podcast, being able to
Right.
talk to each other
Mm-hmm.
across the continents, I would say it's great. It comes with an
Mm-hmm.
environmental cost as well, so we may want to think about it and reflect about it, a wise use of it. But and it's using laws of nature installed by
Mm.
creation, obviously. Um, but say if we just stay with this with these technical possibilities, we can easily forget that we are finite beings in terms of location. So
Yeah.
I'm in a certain place,
Mm.
and I think I'm even meant to live in this place. And although it's great to be able to travel and to meet other people, to talk to people around the world, I should not forget my neighbor. And there is something about
Right.
loving my neighbor which is unique. Uh, I went to see friends just last week, and I think he's been living so in a new flat for 5 months, 6 months, and he told me I don't know my neighbors. I've never met them.
Mm.
I don't even know if there is somebody living in the flat nearby. And I think there's something wrong about this.
Yeah.
And it's liberating also to say I don't have to see everything in this world. So when I look on pictures, I now train myself to say, oh, this is a beautiful picture. These are beautiful mountains, whatever I like, a beautiful historical monument somewhere. And I just look at the picture and say, this is beautiful, and I don't have to go there. I just look at the picture and appreciate this instead of trying to travel around the world and see everything. Because
Yeah.
when I try to do this, yeah, there is a high environmental cost to it, and I won't, in fact, enjoy it as much as if I
Mm.
decide to go to one, to two, to three places, perhaps even to go back to the same places and to enjoy them in a very conscious way. So
Yeah.
if we speak about limits, obviously the distinction between man and woman, I think I don't need to go into details, but this is a
Yeah.
very, very important issue today.
Right.
And I'm just, yeah, I'm really worried of what we are doing, especially to our younger generation, if
Yeah.
we no longer allow them to be either a man or a woman. So if we put this burden on them, I'm not speaking of
Right.
people who are there are difficult pastoral issues here and difficult personal experiences here, but say that there is a framework given by God, and this is good, and
Yeah.
we should help people to appreciate the goodness of the distinction between man and woman.
Yeah. Yeah. There, it's such a burden on top of, all the actual um, implications and realities that go along with not allowing that to be a limit. And I'm talking specifically about the distinction between man and woman, but this is just making me think about how all of these limits that are given by God, because they're a gift, allow us in a way to be content and allow us to be taken care of and to be loved by him. And when we throw those out the window, it creates discontent, whether it's with traveling or whatever it may be. um, it creates this feeling of discontent that I think can really cause not only a lot of issues but a lot of unhappiness and um, yeah, like there's a lack of peace, I think, to the way that we live and we um, function. And I guess that also spills over then to the way that we are meant to love our neighbor. If we're constantly discontent with ourselves and with what we have, there's no way we have the eyes to turn and love our neighbor, which is really what we're meant to do here. So
Yeah,
yeah.
if we Yeah, you're right. Contentment is a very important virtue, in fact. It's not a
Yeah.
very popular virtue these days, but it's a very important virtue. Obviously, the difficult issue here is that there are limits coming from creation and limits
Hmm.
coming from sin.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're intermingled.
Hmm.
For example, getting older, I think contentment is a very important virtue to develop if you want to be a wise and a happy old person. But and part of it is accepting your limits. No, there are things you will not do because you're a limited being. But
Hmm.
obviously, there is limits coming from death, coming from illness, and it's right to rebel or to try to work against them.
Hmm.
So there are difficult issues. Also, when it comes to poverty, I wouldn't want to argue, I really would not want to argue that say poor people just need to be content
Absolutely.
with their situation. So
Right.
there is something, yeah, there is some difficulty in distinguishing between created finitude, which is good, and
Yeah.
then restraints or constraints put onto us because of sin,
Yeah.
either our own or, say, other people's sin, or because we just
Right.
live in a fallen world.
Right. The effects of sin. Yeah, I think that that's definitely a good distinction to make. And on this show, I feel like we talk a lot about the limits caused by sin, not so much creation, but you're right. There's sometimes some overlap and intermingling too. That's difficult to kind of figure out. And so it's important that we're not so black and white and probably prescriptive on that all of the time, because uh, everyone's situation is different. There's some that are very clear, but some that are not. So that's helpful. Well, this has been so wonderful, Dr. Jaeger. I appreciate your time. Your book is now out and available, and I'll make sure to link it so that people know where to get it. Is there anything else that you're working on right now that we should be on the lookout for, or anywhere that we can find more of your work?
I have a website where you can read some of my articles. Many of them are in French, but
Okay.
there are also publications in English. And yeah, there are other books which have been translated into English, so you may want to watch out for them as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, and I hope you have a good rest of your holiday. I hope it's quiet for you.
Yeah, thank you, and especially all my blessings for your pregnancy.
Oh, thank you so much. Outside Ourselves is a part of the 1517 Podcast Network. To learn more about all of our podcasts and all of our shows, please go to 1517.org/podcast. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to following the show, whether you're watching on YouTube or listening on a podcasting platform. And if you enjoyed this conversation, I would love if you could give us a 5-star review wherever you're listening. Or if you have a question, leave a comment in the YouTube comments, and I'll do my best to get back to you. Thanks as always for listening. I'll see you back here in a couple of weeks.